Good evening, families, and thank you very much for joining us here this evening for our Penn University session on Restorative Justice Practices. My name is Kyron Harvell. I'm Director of the STAR grant here at the Lansing School District. STAR stands for School Transformation Accelerates Results. We are very fortunate this evening to have representatives from Resolution Services, Ms. Lisa Bonney and Sydney Sinclair. They're going to provide a phenomenal presentation for us on helping your student work through conflict restoratively. I will turn it over to Resolution Services. And again, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Kyron. We really appreciate it. As Kyron said, we're from Resolution Services Center. My name is Sydney Sinclair. I'm the Restorative Practices Program Manager. And this is my Executive Director, Lisa Bonney. We're really excited to be here with you guys today and talk about what we're really truly passionate about, and that is restorative practices. And the reason why we get into this work is so that we can be able to help your students and all people really genuinely find ways to deal with conflict that allows us to move forward in a transformative way. And me personally, I've worked as an interpersonal conflict mediator for 4 years. I recently took this position here at the center, but I am very happy and I'm proud of the vision and I'm ready to go. So this is some of our first work that we're doing together, Lisa and I, so we're very excited. But so I'm gonna turn it over to her. She's gonna start us off, and thank you guys so much for coming.
All right, good evening. As Sydney and Kyron said, I'm Lisa Bonney. To tell you a little bit about myself, I've worked here at Resolution Services for just over 2 years, doing restorative work with both children and adults. I'm also a parent, I'm a social worker, and most importantly, I'm a believer in people. And as Sydney said, I am also the director of Resolution Services Center. Our nonprofit is one of the largest providers of restorative practices in the state. And in addition, we provide community mediation services, which is a facilitated conversation between two disagreeing parties. It could be that there's a court case involved or not, but when there gets to be neighborhood disputes or a divorce or just somebody owes me money, those are the type of cases we mediate. Our mission is to provide and empower peaceful conflict resolutions. For a little background, our organization has been providing restorative practices to the Lansing schools since 1994. What began as a single program at Pattongill has grown into 14 different Lansing schools from elementary to high school. In addition, we have 5 other school districts in which we provide services. I do restorative work because I really believe it gives a voice to each and every person. It builds relationships or connectivity between people. It promotes responsibility, empathy, and communication. Both Sydney and I are excited to be a part of this engagement program that the Lansing School District is putting on. So we're gonna get started and go over with you an overview of restorative practices and why it's important at home, in school, and in the community. So our outline tonight is gonna follow the 5 main points that are on the screen right now of being able to identify for you what are restorative practices? And then at what point, what does it take to have a restorative conversation? We'll get into more details about asking restorative questions of what's involved in it and what's not, how to use non-violent communication, and what are some things you can do even starting tomorrow. So what are restorative practices? If you look up the definition, and there are quite a few of them, it's defined as a social service that builds social capital and achieves social discipline through participatory learning and decision-making. But what does that mean? When we talk about social capital, what we're talking about is relationships and human interactions. Restorative practices creates a process to engage 2 individuals in the communication with each other. And the other part of that is achieving social discipline. When a wrongdoing happens or when a conflict has occurred, the process to address the harm is to create a sense of community between the two parties so that they feel like they still can have a relationship with each other after the conflict is over. It helps prevent future conflict while it's still addressing the wrongdoing that has happened. So that takes us down through the definition and breaking it down. What does this mean? Restorative practices is encouraging, and it is the practice of direct communication, having listening skills, taking personal responsibility for one's behavior, and having empathy for other people or other situations or other cultures. But before we can kind of get more into what are restorative practices, we're going to spend a little time talking about what is conflict. And again, I'm going to go back to the Webster Dictionary where it says conflict is defined as being different from one another or to fail to be in agreement. And if you can think about conflicts maybe you've had in your life or that have been a part of your family, you can take a look that it can happen between people, between organizations, countries, ideologies, and even when we get stressed, we're in conflict with our own environment because there's so much going on. So conflict happens every day. It's a part of everyday happening. Sometimes it's just a small irritation, like if somebody cuts you off while you're driving to the grocery store, or other times it's a big all-out people yelling and hurting each other. But even though that conflict happens every day, we all have choices that we make in response to that conflict. So if you took a minute to think about the last time you were involved in the conflict, ask yourself what happened. Was someone yelling, crying, lashing out either physically or verbally? And at the same time, what emotions were you feeling, or do you think the other person was going through? Were they anger, shame, abandonment, feeling vulnerable? These are all human emotions. We all react. But as we get into addressing conflict, we can choose to do it in a variety of manners. Restorative response to conflict will get at certain things of envisioning that the relationship is important between you and the person that you're having a conflict with. It's accepting personal responsibility for what happened or what didn't happen, listening, empathy, and also working towards a compromise. So on the slide that we have on the screen now, this is what graphically shows how different people react to conflict. Everyone can react in each different quadrant, and it's also depending on the situation, you may choose one reaction versus the other. So to kind of walk you through this process, I'm gonna use a real life example. I have a son. My son has ADD. So it's a real challenge, and it's hard enough to keep him focused and on top of his homework and making sure that all those responsibilities get done. But in addition to that, we also have an expectation that at least once a week, your bedroom will be cleaned. So more often than not, it happens, I can say, is that we will get to Saturday afternoon. He will want to run out and go play with his friends or get on his Xbox, and mom's going to come in and look and say, uh-oh, the room's not clean. So again, we have a conflict. He has something he wants to go do and his priorities, and mom has my priorities and what I needs to get done. So when we describe how you respond to conflict, I'm going to go through each of these quadrants, and I'm going to have you think about as I go through this, whose needs are being met in the different responses here. Was it me as a mom or my son's? And then also, what emotions or reactions do you think are present when we're responding to conflict in this way? The first one we're going to start out with is in the box called not, the neglectful corner. What that means is that the situation is that we're going to pretend it doesn't exist, or it's being ignored, and we're just not going to address that something is occurring. In the situation of my son who needs to get his room cleaned before he can get on his electronics, it could be I'm walking in, I'm seeing him already, deeply inside a video game. I'm going to look in his room, say, oh, it's not cleaned yet. And then I'm just going to pull the door shut. I'm just going to pretend it isn't there. I'm going to ignore it. So I'm not going to engage in any type of conversation or reaction about that there's a difference in expectations here of the room needs to be cleaned before you go on your electronics. So that's kind of the not quadrant. If we move over to the right, we get into the for box. And what this means is it's the permissive response. We are looking at taking care of someone, excusing the behavior, making up a reason why it did or didn't happen. We're rescuing people. So in the situation of my son, it's like I come in, the room's not clean, he's off doing what he's doing. So mom is going to step up and say, well, I'll do it for him. He's too busy, he's too tired, whatever. I'm going to come up with some rationale that I'm going to go do it for him. He's not going to have to lift a finger, and I'm going to go do that. But at that same time, I'm probably internalizing all this anguish. I'm getting mad, I'm getting resentful. I'm labeling him as lazy or not paying attention to what needs to happen. And then I am reacting to that in a non-positive way. And that's eventually probably going to come out later in the day when we're trying to figure out that he wants something more and I'm going to have to raise this issue up. If we scoot along up to the top left where we go to the 2, that's the punitive quadrant. That is when I am going to do something to my son because he did not clean his room. I'm going to go in there and say, nope, I'm taking your Xbox away. I'm giving you a timeout. You can't go outside until you do this. I am going to put you in your room and you can't come out until it gets done. Which at this stage, there's probably some crying and some whining and a little negotiating and trying to, oh, I don't want to do this, but mom's going to say, no, 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 we're going to get this done. You can't do what you want to do until you get your responsibility done. So that's kind of the description of the punitive box. Restorative practices lives within the with box. And by with, that is helping conversations, having an approach to the conflict by asking, let's cooperate together. Let's collaborate together. You take responsibility for you, I'll take responsibility for me, and then together, without getting mad at each other or being resentful, we're going to work together. In this type of situation, it would be if it's not done, I'm standing in the door going, oh, okay, do you want to play your Xbox? What do you need to do to help me get my needs met? You need to pick up your clothes. So how about if I go get you the laundry basket, you start pulling your clothes together, I will get you the laundry basket and then you can put it in there and then that'll be done. And then once that step's done, you're going, okay, you've got toys all over your room. And probably doing a little reminding that, well, sometimes the dog gets in here, and if the dog chews up one of your toys, you're going to be really sad. So do you think maybe we could together pick up your toys, put them away in the box so the toys don't get destroyed, and then your room is straightened up and you can go. Again, it's that working together to come up with a solution that both my needs and my son needs get met. So when we put all this together, we think of the 5 R's of restorative practices. And they're listed on the screen here. The big and foremost one is relationships. Human beings need relationships. We need interaction, whether it's with our child, between your child and their friends, or you and your friends, you and your family. It's having that common bond, that common relationship that make us full human beings. It also includes respect. We have to have the respect that we're going to stop and listen. We also expect the other person to stop and listen. And through that mutual exchange, being able to hear what the other person has to say and take it to heart. Responsibility. If someone's not willing to accept responsibility that they harmed something or did something wrong, then that's a big component of restorative practices. People have to take a look at themselves, say, what did I do? What did you do? And then take that responsibility for their actions, their words, whatever they did. Repair is a big thing. Not only are we pointing out what happened and how people have been hurt, but we also want to open it up as how do we get past this? How do we know that we can move past what happened and get to the next step, which is reintegration, i.e. that they're part of the family again. They're part of the community again because we're not mad at them. We're not angry at them. They are working through the 5 R's. We are too. And at that point in time, we get to a restorative approach. So when this all comes together, that is formulated here in this graphic. Because a restorative approach requires not only the language we use, the words we use, it also implies what our conduct is going to be. You know, how are we physically reacting to the conflict? At the most of it, because we have to take a second and think about what our response is going to be, we call that the mindset. It's that thought process that we go through together to say, how do I want to react to this conflict, and where do I want to be at the end of the conversation? The approach is to make sure it's safe and supportive for everyone, that there is care for the ongoing relationship. It's not just, oh, I'm going to punish you and going to make me feel better, but it's that it's caring for the person beyond whatever behavior or whatever incident happened. And as I said before, it's the working together to meet both personal needs. It's not just one person's needs over another. Both individuals approach the situation saying, we both have needs that need to be done. So going over what exactly is to have a restorative conversation. We talked a little bit about, on the social discipline window in the quadrants, the with mindset of having that idea that you want to work with someone so you both get your needs met. And probably the best way to describe this is that it's a compass, not a map. There is no prescriptive guidelines that says if you do A, B, C, and D, you're going to be restorative. But it is having the thought process of saying, well, I've got this situation, i.e. my son hasn't cleaned his room. I want to be at the end of the day where he cleans his room and I don't have to do it for him. So having that, I know where I want to end up. What needs to transpire? So I'm engaging my child, but I'm also not rescuing him. I'm also not doing it for him. So that's where we get to it. It's a compass, not a map. It's also a cognitive choice. As we said earlier, humans have a nature to react. And when the person has been hurt, the choice of reaction can also be hurtful back. But in restorative, we try to make sure that our response in our words and our actions are supportive and working towards our compass direction of where we want to be at the end of the day. It's also a journey, not a race. Restorative conversations, restorative practice is not a quick fix. It's not a one or done. It's not do it once and you're going to see total personality transformation. It takes reaching out again and again in the same manner to give a restorative conversation another try. The next time you do it, and there will be a next time, you try again. And eventually your child sees that you're offering them an opportunity to resolve their conflicts restoratively, they become more comfortable joining in the process. Instead of saying, I don't know, or I don't care, or not thinking it through, they become more comfortable joining in. They'll be able to put into words about their feelings, what they were thinking, what they thought other people were thinking of them. They'll be able to recognize the same components in other people. Maybe they can realize that what they said might have hurt somebody or might have made them angry. They'll be able to admit to a wrongdoing or communicate how they were wronged to the person. They'll find a way to get over it, to make amends, or just to move past it. And they'll also be able to formulate a plan to how to deal with conflict in the future. So the more you practice it, the more readily it becomes a tool in your toolbox. I always tell parents, it's kind of like riding a bicycle. When you're trying to teach your kid to ride a bicycle, the first time they're horrible, they need a lot of support and a lot of direction. The second time, maybe they get a little better and a little better, but eventually, because they are going through the same steps with you over and over again, it becomes a habit and it becomes an approach that they internalize, that you can then say, well, we can end up at the end of the day in a positive place instead of having additional hurt put on top of the missed expectations. So it's at this stage I'm going to switch it over to Sydney. She'll go over some specifics of the restorative approach.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you guys again for having us here. We're really excited. I know that when we had talked about what we would like this time to look like, Lisa and I had talked extensively about actually giving you guys some tools to be able to use these skills in your personal life and your professional life, and that's really what we're trying to do. So in these next two sections, we're going to talk about the practical aspects of restorative practices and how to have a restorative conversation. So the two practical parts of it is, it's a simple equation, right? So you can think of it as giving emotions and receiving emotions. So the first one that we're going to go through is receiving emotions, and that means learning how to and unlearning how to ask restorative questions and making sure that we use language and conduct that fits in line with our restorative vision. So that's what we're going to talk about firstly. And so in this section, we're going to talk about how to ask open-ended questions. We're going to talk about how to receive the emotions of others empathetically. And we're also going to talk about what it would look like to reframe and reflect and push back more probing questions onto your children, and maybe even friends and family when you get into those kind of difficult conversations. So that's what we're going to focus on for this section. So like I had said, we're gonna talk about open-ended questions. We're gonna talk about what the process looks like and how actually your student or your child has autonomy in the process and how they have a voice to be able to air their concerns and express themselves. We're also going to talk about what it looks like to actually help our students build traits, like Lisa had said before, to deal with conflict effectively in the future. That's the goal, right? That's the point of why we do what we do, is to give them those skills so they can be able to deal with this into adulthood. And like Lisa had mentioned, our first section, we kind of talked about what the mindset looks like and, you know, what that entails and how to actually approach a restorative conversation. So now we're going to actually talk about one of our other bubbles, which is conduct. So listening, receiving, throwing it back, understanding how to, you know, genuinely engage with your student on these difficult conversations. So the first one we're going to get into is open-ended questions. So when Lisa and I had talked about this originally, you know, we had jokingly made a comment that, you know, okay, so if we're going to talk about open-ended questions, we have to talk about closed questions. But it is true, right? Closed questions are a real thing. So closed questions would be something along the lines of, I'm asking you a question that I already know the answer to. I'm pointing you in a specific direction because I want a specific answer. I'm not really allowing you to fully express yourself. I'm kind of baiting you into giving me the answer that I want, right? So an example of a closed question would be, why are you so mad? You know, or maybe something along the lines of, why would you do it that way? That's so silly. Or why would you think that's a good idea? So you're projecting your own judgment against that action, right? And so we're going to try to avoid that. Those sorts of questions really shuts down dialogue. So that's what we want to try to avoid, is those closed questions. So open-ended questions is really, it's truly seeking first to understand. I know that Lisa had mentioned that in the beginning, but what we're trying to do here is genuinely understand from another person's perspective, you know, how they were thinking, how they were feeling, you know, what was going on inside their mind, what their perspective was. And this, again, like I had mentioned, this is what facilitates rapport. By asking open-ended questions, we genuinely engage our student in this process, and we are able to relate to them on a level that we wouldn't have been able to if we were using closed questions, or maybe just making statements and not asking questions at all. So transitioning into power in the process, I know I had briefly mentioned this, but essentially what this means is that the restorative process genuinely gives our students and our children the ability to take the reins on the problem-solving process, and it gives them the ability to work collaboratively with us in trying to find a solution or reach a resolution. So in this process, you're allowing them to be involved. Oftentimes, when we think about, you know, professionally, think about how students are disciplined in schools, oftentimes that's exclusionary. So you either are given a detention or you're given a suspension, maybe even expulsion, but that doesn't necessarily teach you anything. And so the reason why we ask restorative questions is to be able to teach our children and to teach our students, you know, this is how we deal with things, this is how we ask questions, this is how we are in relationship to one another, and this is how we address hurt and harm. And so in this process as well, they have power over the outcomes. They can be included in the decision-making and logical consequences that might result from that. And so the real goal of this is that students are actively involved in their own solutions. And that's what we want to do. That's how we get into that trait building aspect, right? So when we get into this mode, right, when we allow students to actually engage in the process and to be a part of their own solutions, they build the necessary traits to be successful in life. And that's really what we're trying to do with the restorative process. And really, when you take away a student's ability or a child's ability to, you know, solve their own problems or answer their own questions, we're only teaching them learned helplessness. We're not actually teaching them the skills to be able to be more effective adults and deal with conflict in the future. So by asking open-ended questions, we're helping them build those traits to be more successful. And this specifically as well, open-ended questions is designed specifically to avoid shame. And I know that when I say shame, that might give you a couple different ideas of what I'm talking about. And I know that, you know, it might look differently to other people than to me. You know, it's a very personal, emotional feeling. But I know that when I am feeling shameful or when I'm feeling regretful over my choices, I don't necessarily want to have a conversation about that. And so when we ask open-ended questions, we're specifically using them to not instill shame in our students. And so that's a very intentional way that we can kind of bypass those automatic negative emotions and actually get into the problem solving and collaborating. How can we work together? How can we figure this out? Let's do it. So that's really what we're looking at, is that trait building to help them be more successful adults in the future. So we're going to get into the actual restorative questions. Okay, so there's 4 of them we're going to discuss today. And the first one is, what happened? Now, this is a very basic exploratory question. Essentially, what you're trying to understand is what happened from your student's perspective. All right. So oftentimes we would ask these open-ended restorative questions when a conflict or hurt or harm has been caused. So directly after that, we go into the question asking phase. And this is what we're going to talk about, is some questions that you can ask your students at that point. So the first question, what happened? Now, I know that seems kind of like a silly question, and you may know what happened from your perspective, but the thing is that we're trying to understand what happened from your student's perspective. We're trying to gain some understanding into their lived experience, and from what they saw, what they heard, what they experienced. That's what we're trying to do. And as I'll talk about later on as we go through the questions, this process is really a give and take. We're not only asking to be involved in the emotional world of our students and our children, but also for them to be involved in our emotional worlds. And through that exchange, we really can transform conflict. And that's where we're trying to get to. And through asking these specific questions, we can actually get to that place and find a resolution that meets all of our needs. So the first question, what happened? Now, there are different ways that you could phrase this, right? So there are some dehumanizing ways that you could phrase this and some humanizing ways. Now, I won't go through the dehumanizing ways, but I just threw some up on the screen so that you guys can look at that. So essentially what we're doing, like Lisa had talked about earlier, is we're trying to humanize and human center this process. So we're trying to understand from our student or our child's perspective, what happened? So you could say that in what happened, you could say something along the lines of, what's going on? Are you okay? Or you could say something really explicit like, can you help me understand what happened from your perspective? Obviously, like Lisa had mentioned as well, this is a compass, not a map. You don't have to ask it in this specific way. You can draft up your own question, but essentially what you're trying to do with the first question is to understand what happened from their perspective. And oftentimes, it's when we don't feel heard or listened to, it can be difficult to engage in a conversation about what happened. So by immediately starting off by saying, hey, help me understand what's going on. Let me pick your brain. What's going on? Tell me about it. Engaging them in that sort of dialogue, that really gets them to join in on the conversation and to take a part of it. And that's where we're trying to get to. And so we're not spreading judgment. We're not making assumptions. We're just asking, hey, what happened? Help me understand. And this is a way that you can step into the shoes of your students. Oftentimes we may have ideas about what their choices were and why they made those choices. But again, we're trying to push back those assumptions and just understand from their perspective what was going on. So that's what we do with the first question. Again, exploratory, just, hey, help me understand what happened from your perspective. So let's move into the second question. And the second is, what were you thinking at the time, or how were you feeling in the moment? And again, this question is another way that we can step closer and closer into their emotional space, where we can get into that synchronous back and forth engagement, where we're able to understand each other in a new light, in a new way. And so what were you thinking? This is where we're looking for specifically pointed emotional language. What we're looking for is, well, I was really frustrated because of blank, or, I'm just really sad because of such and such happening at school, and that's why I didn't want to do my homework. That's what we're looking for, right? We're looking for pointed emotional language. So I feel, I am, I was, that sort of language. And when your students do engage in this conversation with you, and when they do give you those emotions, I want you to encourage you to actually encourage them in that, because sometimes it can be really difficult to express our emotions. I know even as an adult, it's hard for me sometimes. I'm sure it's hard for you. So when people make the point, and when our students specifically take the steps to express their vulnerability and express their emotions, we want to honor that. So by just saying something simple like, hey, thanks so much for sharing. I really appreciate that. It really hurts me to know that you were in pain earlier today, or it really hurts me to know that you were sad earlier today. Do you want to talk about it? And that's how you can open up the conversation more and more. So basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to get as much information as you possibly can, so you can start seeing the full picture of why what happened and how we can move forward in a productive way. So again, some questions that you could use would be, what were you thinking at the time? How were you feeling in the moment? And I think the most crucial aspect of this is, how are you feeling now? So when we talk about the past, we always want to move to the future. So once you understand from their perspective how they were feeling in the moment, you want to understand how they're feeling now. Because oftentimes when we have time to reflect upon our actions, we feel regret, we feel shame, we feel embarrassed. And so we want to also acknowledge that, right? And say, you know what, we all make mistakes. I make mistakes every day. I'm an adult, that's a part of being human. That's a part of living life. But what matters is taking those mistakes, taking responsibility for them, repairing any relationships and harm that we caused, and then making a plan so that we don't have to deal with this in the future and that we don't come to the situation again. That's the goal. And so in this point, we really don't want to ask questions like, why are you so upset? I know I had mentioned that before, like, why are you so angry? You don't want to name someone's emotions for them, because instead of actually being able to name their emotions, you're actually taking away their agency in that period, and they have to defend themselves against the accusation that you put onto them, right? So they might not necessarily be mad. You may think that they're mad, but maybe they're more frustrated or sad, and it kind of spilled over into anger and those kind of automatic and negative things. And so we really want to understand from their perspective how they're feeling. So we want to be able to, we're not going to suggest any emotions. We're just going to say, hey, what were you thinking? How are you feeling? Things like that. And this is, in this way, when we actually name someone's emotions for them, this is called observation with evaluation. And this can be really dangerous. And I just want to talk about this really briefly, right? So let's say, for example, you are driving down the road, you're going to work. Let's say you're running late. Maybe you had a disagreement with your spouse in the morning. You're entering into the highway and someone zooms past you and actually cuts you off to get in front of you and then slams on their brake because there's a slowdown in traffic or something like that, right? So I'm putting myself in that person's shoes, right? So I'm driving in the car. I had an argument with my spouse. I'm running a little bit late and then someone cuts me off, right? My automatic thought is, wow, that person is so rude. That person is such a jerk. I can't believe they would do that. How inconsiderate, how self-centered. You know, those are our automatic thoughts, right? But I'm not evaluating. I'm more evaluating what I think he's doing and why he's making those choices, but I'm not actually trying to understand why he made those choices. So maybe he was in the same situation as me, right? Maybe he got into an argument with his spouse. Maybe he was late for work. Maybe he's just trying to get to work on time. And his actions actually didn't reflect on me at all. It wasn't personal. It was just what happened, right? So when we take a step back and we're able to genuinely reflect on what occurred, and especially for our students too, they can kind of address, you know, how am I thinking? How am I feeling? And when we name it for them, we take away their ability to do that. And so that's why we try to avoid that and just genuinely ask those open-ended questions with no thought in sight, just trying to understand where they're coming from. So let's move into the third question. And so this third question is, who has been affected and in what ways? So like I had mentioned before, right, the first two questions, you're trying to enter into the emotional space of your student. Now, I want them to enter into my emotional space or the emotional space of others, right? So again, it's that reflexive back and forth. That's what we're really trying to get at. And so by asking the question, who has been affected in what ways, you kind of get to that point of, you know, I walked in your shoes, now try to walk in mine. And so in this specific question, we're actually allowing our students to engage in that dialogue around, okay, so I made this choice. I did it because I felt this, but I didn't necessarily think how it was going to impact others. Maybe I should do that. And this is I will be honest, this is a difficult question. Oftentimes we receive a lot of hesitancy, and I know that Lisa can speak to that as well. There's a lot of resistance and pushback when you ask this question from time to time. And that just means, you know what, let's ask another probing question. Let's keep at it. Like Lisa had said, we can't give up. You have to keep practicing this, right? And the first couple of times it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be new. It's going to be different. But I am telling you that when you get to this question and the fourth question, this is where you see conflict transform. This is where you get kids to really get into that headspace of, okay, let me think about myself. Let me think about others. And then for us as well as adults, let me think about myself and let me think about others. So again, this question is, who has been affected by this situation and in what ways? So really, this is where the process kind of clicks. The student begins to understand, okay, I walked a mile in her shoes, she's gonna walk a mile in mine. It's this reflexive back and forth. You know, I'm not being in any way, shape, or form forced to talk about this. I'm just being encouraged to, right? And this is where they begin the work to be able to empathize with the positions of others. And if this question is difficult for them, like I had mentioned before, oftentimes you can, you know, throw it back on them, ask another probing question and say something along the lines of like, if you were in my shoes or if you were in their shoes, how would you feel, right? So getting to them engage with, okay, if I were in this position and I was hurt or harmed by the choices of another person, how would I feel in that moment? So that's what we're trying to do with this third question. So let's move into the fourth question. And this is the final question, and I promise, and then we're actually going to do something really fun and have a break. And Lisa and I are going to do a role play with you because we want you to be able to know how to actually ask these questions in real time. And we want you to walk away with something that you can actually try tonight, you can try tomorrow, you can try the next day, and then every day after that. That's our goal. So we want to kind of give you an example, an explicit example of like, this is what it would actually look like to actively practice out this process. So let's talk about the fourth question and then we'll get into that. So the fourth question is, how do you make things right? So after we get to that empathizing piece where we're able to get our student to understand maybe where we're coming from or where another person's coming from, we ask them, how do you make things right? Or what do you think needs to happen in order to make things right? Oftentimes I err towards that one. What do you think needs to happen in order to make things right? Because I don't necessarily want to just say, what do you need to do? You know, so by just framing it a little bit differently, like we said, language is important. By framing it a little bit differently, the question can have a totally different impact on our children. So by saying something along the lines of, what do you think needs to happen in order to make things right? And so this is where we get into the action-oriented planning stage, where we actually get to be able to, like I had said before, where our students have the opportunity to take control over their own fate, right? They're able to actually engage in the process and create their own solutions. So that's why we ask this question. And this is oftentimes we ask questions like this and we get to an agreement phase, and where in the school process, in the school restorative process, it would be a little bit more formal. We would actually have written agreements up with students, but with parents and students, right, it's just a set agreement. It's just, hey, we're agreeing that we're gonna treat each other like this moving forward. And that's the way that we want to be in relationship with one another and for our house to be in community with one another. And I will tell you until I'm blue in the face, I honestly believe in this process. And I think that when you give students the ability to actually address conflict in this way, they readily seize on the opportunity to have a little bit of voice, right? Voice is really crucial for our growing kids. And when they feel like they have voice, they're actively engaged, right? When they feel like they have something worth belonging to, they're ready to do it. They're ready to go. And so when we give them agency in this process and we allow them to take, the reins of it and say, this is mine, I'm going to try to solve my own problems, that's where we get that trait building. And that's where we get effective, productive, emotionally comprehensive and well-being of students. So that's what we're really looking for. So now we're going to switch into a little bit before we do the role play, overcoming resistance or pushback. So I just kind of wanted to give you guys some ideas of if these are responses that you're receiving from your student, and you're getting maybe a little bit of pushback from them, instead of just the conversation shutting down, these are some things that you can say to get the conversation back up and moving again. So Lisa will probably attest to this as well. I hear the answer as a restorative practitioner, well, I don't know, 1,000 times a day. I swear to God, it's maybe the only thing I've ever heard from students, like the initial thing that they say is, I don't know. So instead of just saying, well, okay, and then giving up on the conversation, one way that you can push back on that is saying something along the lines of, hey, I know this might be uncomfortable. I know this might be difficult, but we're going to work through it together. So let's do that together, right? Emphasizing the together, that they're not in this alone. Like Lisa had said with the with box, right? High control, high support. We're going to give them as much support as possible so that they can really own this process. So I know this might be difficult. I know this might be uncomfortable, but let's do it together. Something else that we hear is, I don't really think it's that big of a deal. Oftentimes when we hear something like this, there might be a little bit of shame. I notice a little bit of shame in students when they say something like this. Well, I didn't think it was going to end up like that, or I didn't think it's really that big of a deal. So just acknowledging, hey, it might not be that big of a deal to you, but it's a really big deal to me, or it's a big deal to them. And I would really like us to talk about it, right? Emphasizing the us. Emphasizing that, there are emotional impacts outside of yourself when you get into difficult conflict situations, and acknowledging that and addressing that. Something else we hear a lot is they're just overreacting or you're just overreacting. Again, saying, hey, you might think it's an overreaction, but it's actually really important to me that we discuss it. And then just making sure that the conversation doesn't break down, right? And then again, well, how was I supposed to know that that was going to happen? Same thing in line of, I didn't think it was really that big of a deal. You can just kind of emphasize, hey, I understand that. Like I had said earlier, you can tell your students and acknowledge, I make mistakes all the time. That's what it means to be human. But what matters is how we move forward from that and transform our relationship or transform this conflict. That's what matters. Okay, so Lisa and I are going to get into this role play really quickly, and I apologize if our acting is terrible. We are not theater majors, but we will try as much as we can to help you guys understand what this process looks like practically. So I'm just going to give you a quick little snippet of what the situation is that you're walking into. I'm going to play the role of the parent. Lisa is going to play the role of my son, David, and we're just kind of going to get into a back and forth about, what happened using those 4 restorative questions. So let's say, for example, let's say tonight you get home from actual parent university. Well, you are home already, but anyway, you're with your students and you hear a loud noise up above in your house. And you notice that there's some commotion, there's some running around, there's some loud noises. So you go up there, and what you see, immediately you walk into your daughter's room and you see your daughter yelling, partially crying, and then you see your son throwing things around, things that aren't his, not his belongings, and tossing them to the side and kind of yelling and getting angry. And then what you do in that moment, this is crucial, right? What do you do when you walk into something like that? What I would recommend as a restorative practitioner is to separate them, because those high emotions, it's no conversation in that moment is going to be good. So making sure that they're both into a safe place where they can kind of cool down, and then you can go and have conversations with both of them separately. So I'm going to give you an example of a conversation that I'm going to have with David. And just so you know, up until this point, essentially some baseball cards had gone missing that belonged to David. He assumed that Jenna had taken them, and he's under the assumption that she is a thief, and she's really upset. He's really upset, and that's why he was tearing apart the room. Okay, so let's get started. So the first question I'm going to ask is our first restorative question. Okay, David, help me understand what happened from your perspective.
Mom, you got to come help me. Jenna took my cards. I know she has them in here. She always stealing my stuff. Come help me find my cards.
Okay, what makes you think that Jenna took your cards? Did you see her take the cards?
Well, she was downstairs and she was touching them. And you know how she likes to touch my stuff and then she breaks stuff. So I know she has my cards because I can't find them.
I understand your concern, but I'm asking, did you specifically see her take the cards up to her room or hide them in any way, shape, or form?
No, but I know she took them.
Okay, so is it accurate to say that you assumed that she took them?
Well, yeah.
Okay, so what did you actually see Jenna do with the cards?
She was downstairs touching my stuff. I had to run out to go let the dog out. And then I come back and the cards are gone. Nothing's in the same place it was. Jenna's not in the room. The cards aren't in the room. So I know she took them.
Okay. All right. So that would be an example of the first question. Again, I asked a lot of probing questions. It wasn't just, hey, help me understand what happened from your perspective. I'm trying to get as much information out as possible. So that would be the first question. Now we're going to move into the second question, which is, what were you feeling? What were you thinking in the moment? So David, help me understand how you felt.
I'm mad. She's always doing this to me. I just want my stuff. I want her to stop touching my stuff.
Okay. I can understand what it's like to be angry. I don't want to feel that way. Do you want to feel that way?
No, I don't like it. But again, she's got to give me my stuff.
No, I completely understand. I hope that we can get to the bottom of this and come to a resolution. So what specifically are you mad about? Are you mad that you assumed that she took your things and that's what the real anger is behind?
Well, I just don't want her touching my stuff because she knows how much I really like my cards and they're real important to me. And then sometimes things get lost or she hides them.
Okay. All right. Thank you, David. So now we're going to transition into the third question. Since I understand how he was feeling in the moment, now I'm going to try to get him to understand maybe what Jenna was feeling and also honoring and valuing that he also had negative emotions in the situation as well. Okay. So David, help me understand how you think other people have been impacted by this situation.
Well, I mean, Jenna's not talking to me anymore and I know she's mad at me because I was tearing up her room, but I don't know.
Okay, so I'm hearing that you're saying that she may be frustrated, maybe a little bit upset. Is that how you feel as well? That's what I remember from our previous question.
Yeah, I
Okay.
do.
Okay. So what do you think needs to happen? Now we're see how quick that is? Now I'm transitioning into the fourth question. So he can understand what Jenna might be going through. So let's get into hey, what can we do to remedy this situation? How can we address it? So what do you think needs to happen in order to make things right?
Well, I need my cards back. And if she didn't take them, then she was the last one in the room with them. Maybe she knows what happened to them.
Do you think that maybe we should have a conversation with her?
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think Jenna might need to make things right in this situation?
I don't know.
I know this might be difficult. I understand that, but we're going to work through it together. So put yourself in her shoes, right? If you were in her role, right? How would you feel if someone had been throwing maybe some things around in your room?
Well, if she can help me find my cards, I guess I could help her clean up her room.
Okay. Thank you, David. Okay, so that's perfect. So that's just a quick example. And I will let you know that Lisa and I kind of improv that a little bit. So it really takes some learning. That's a skill that you hone over time. I will say that when you start practicing this, it kind of falls into place. Once you do it over and over and over again, the process becomes more natural. So thank you, Lisa. I appreciate it. So we're going to move into another section. But before we do that, I just kind of want to go over quickly what we talked about in this section. So we talked about the open-ended questions. We talked about what it looks like to allow our students to have power in the process. We talked about trait building, and we went through the 4 questions. And if you have any questions about specific things, please feel free to enter those into the chat. And at the end of this conversation, we'll be able to address them. We're really excited for that portion because I know that you might have some specific questions, and hopefully Lisa and I can give you some clarity on those things, okay? So we're going to move into our fourth and final section, which is about speaking out our emotions, right? So we call this nonviolent communication or compassionate communication. So communication is both listening and speaking. So we're going to talk about the speaking aspect of that. So what is compassionate communication? I know that might seem like a buzzword, and I apologize about that, but essentially what that just means is actually trying to be intentional and conscious about the way that we communicate with one another in an attempt to not cause any more harm or to cause any, uncomfort or discomfort, any sort of negative emotion. So it's just an intentional way of speaking to one another, and it's a conscious shift from speaking to maybe the automatic ways that we were thinking and feeling into, different restorative ways of thinking and feeling and expressing that in a restorative way. And so this, like this quote says, it really allows us to kind of share from the heart what we're thinking and feeling. And in that way, like I had mentioned earlier, that's where you get that emotional vulnerability, and that's where the conflict transformation comes from. So now you've asked the questions, right? Now you need to express, how you're feeling about the situation. So in this section, we're going to go through what it would look like to actually use consciously compassionate communication, and practically what that would look like through using I statements, which is just essentially taking ownership for your own feelings and saying, I feel this when this happens, right? Not you make me feel this way. And then we're also going to talk through what a model of compassionate communication would look like with your student. And for that, we're going to give you a different example than the David example, because I kind of want to provide you with something that looks a little bit different. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to put those in the chat and we will address them when we get to the Q&A section. So let's talk about consciously compassionate communication. So oftentimes when we get into conflictual situations with each other, we often say things that actually alienate us from one another and alienate us from compassion. And again, that's going to shut down rapport. That's not going to invite our students into a conversation with us. So what we want to do, like I've said a million times before, language is crucial. We want to be really intentional about our language. And that's why we use consciously compassionate communication. And in this way, we're able to, we're able to be approachable, we're able to be, person-centered, we're able to be self-reflective, we're able to actually express what we want, need, feel in a way that is actually person-centered and in a way that won't alienate people from, our point and our concerns. So let's talk about I statements. I know I had mentioned it briefly, but I statements essentially is just saying, I feel blank. I know that's really simple, but oftentimes, I know I even revert to this sometimes when I'm not being intentional about my language is, you make me so mad. I can't believe you would do something like that. That's not being compassionately communicative. So by saying, let me give you an example. Okay. Let's say, okay, let's go back to the driving example. Okay, so maybe I actually end up speaking to that person who cut me off because I get to a gas station and he's also fueling up at the same time as me. So I take it upon myself to confront him about this in a compassionate way. And so instead of saying like, you're such a jerk, I can't believe you cut me off, how can you be so self-centered, blah, 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 things like that. What I say, if I'm being intentionally communicative and compassionate, I would say something along the lines of, hey, I feel really frustrated when I get cut off. I know that probably wasn't intentional, but I just want you to know that that's how I'm feeling. So again, so you're not saying you make me feel so mad. You're saying, hey, I feel frustrated when this happens to me. And that's just a simple shift that we can do to be more intentionally compassionate. And that really helps, like I had said, it helps the conversation get going and get moving. So let's talk about what this would look like with a practical example. So this specific model communication, it's called nonviolent communication or compassionate communication. So what you are really looking for in this process is you're looking for describing what you're observing, what you're feeling in relation to what you observe, what your needs, values, desires are in relation to those feelings, and then requests that would make your life better. So it's this simple process. And in the toolkit that we'll give you at the end of this recording, you'll be able to actually see the process like this again, so that you'll be able to take it home and practice it and work on it in that way. So let's walk it through together. So let's say, for example, you're at home with your student, you're working from home, they're doing homework from home or school from home, and you walk in on them sitting in on a class and they're actually sleeping. Okay, so there's a lot of automatic and negative emotions that come rushing towards you, right? So let's find a way to compassionately communicate that while still meeting our needs, but also expressing in a compassionate way, hey, this doesn't work for me. Let's try to find a resolution. So first thing, right? So a dehumanizing way that you could approach this would say something along the lines of, you could just start off by saying you're so lazy, or you're so careless, or you just don't care about anything, you know? Those are some dehumanizing ways to say it. But if we're going to use the nonviolent communication, compassionate communication model, what we would say is specifically the concrete thing that we observed, right? So I know it might sound silly, but you're going to say something along the lines of like, I saw that you were sleeping. And in the second part, it'll make more sense why I said that. But you're literally just going to say what you observed, right? Hey, I walked into your room this afternoon and I noticed that you were sleeping. Or, hey, I just came in, I noticed that you're sleeping. Something along the lines of that. So now let's talk about the second part. So how do we feel in relationship to what we saw? So a dehumanizing way to approach that would be say something like, I feel so betrayed. I feel so disappointed. You might feel those negative emotions, right? But how can we communicate that to our student in a way that doesn't alienate them from the conversation? So you can say something along the lines of like, hey, I'm feeling really frustrated. So let's go back to the first one, right? So, hey, I walked in this afternoon or this morning, I saw that you were sleeping and I'm feeling really frustrated. So once you name your emotion, right, you're going to explain why you feel that way. And that's where we get into the needs that are missing that create our feelings. So let's say, for example, you say something along the lines of, I just need you to do your homework, or I just need you to pay attention. That's not going to get us anywhere conversationally. So one way to rephrase that would be something along the lines of like, hey, trust is really important to me. I need dependability in my life. When I don't have dependability, I tend to feel frustrated, right? So you're looping back up to, hey, I'm feeling frustrated. So I walked in on you. I noticed that you were sleeping during class. I'm feeling really frustrated. Trust is really important to me and dependability is as well. And when I don't feel those ways and I don't see that in my relationship with people, I tend to feel frustrated. So again, you're just rephrasing things. So you're still being able to express your emotions. You're still being able to name them and take ownership over them, but you're doing it in a compassionate way. So let's get into the fourth one. This is the final one that you'll do. And this is just simply making requests that would make your life better or make the situation better for you personally, right? And so this here, we're not going to be forceful. Like Lisa had said, in the restorative box, we do things with people, right? So let's come up with a collaborative solution. So one way that you could say this would be something along the lines of like, would you be willing to communicate with me in the future if you're feeling sleepy during class? We could find ways to help you stay awake together. Let's talk it through, let's find some solutions. And that's really what it looks like, right? So, hey, I walked in and I noticed that you were sleeping. I felt really frustrated. I really need trust and dependability in my life. When I don't feel that way, I tend to feel frustrated. When you're feeling sleepy in class, I understand that that's a natural thing that happens to everyone. But when you're feeling sleepy during class, will you come to me and let me know, and then we can try to problem solve together? That's literally it. That's all you have to say, right? And then you're not alienating them. You're including them in the conversation and you're inviting them to discuss it. So that's the point. So that's really what we're looking for. So again, we talked about what this looks like, using consciously compassionate communication, using the I statements, and using a model of compassionate communication to be able to express your feelings in a way that's approachable and person-centered. That's what we're looking for. So as we close out, I just want to kind of remind us to what we talked about in the beginning, and that really is that being restorative means being truly human and honoring that humanness in ourselves and in others. And when we share the emotional space with each other, when we're able to, exude that emotional vulnerability and come to that point where we can transform conflict, that's what allows us to, really change for the future and for the better. That's where we're getting to that at. And so we really wanted to thank you guys so much for joining in on this with us. We really appreciate it. I wanted to share with you as well that I know I had mentioned the toolkit. The toolkit will be available on our website, which is restorativejusticemichigan.org, and just MI for Michigan. You can also feel free to email us at any time, and then you can also call us at any time. We are here to be a resource to you guys, and we really appreciate you guys listening in. So thank you.
Wow, thank you guys very much for such a phenomenal presentation. At this time, we are taking any questions in the chat. Actually, I have a question. What are the rates in terms of decreases in suspensions that we've seen in the state of Michigan as a result of schools that are implementing restorative practices? Do we have the stats for that, or nationally in terms of suspension rates?
Well, I guess I can just speak a little bit for our organization and a couple of the studies we've been involved in. Because within the last 2 years, we've been in a statewide study that looked at suspension and attendance in different school districts that were doing restorative practices. And they definitely were seeing that more students were staying in school, having less suspension days, but also being more engaged that way. When we take a look at our own statistics, we kind of measure on a couple different measures. One is the quantitative feedback. What are the comments coming back? What are the things that we can see students are learning and growing through the RJ process? And it's probably easy to say about 80 to 90%, and I'm sorry, I don't know the exact number, basically say that they learned something through restorative work and that they know that they can apply that in a future area of conflict.
Is there a specific demographic in terms of age where you guys have found the most positive outcomes as far as an age group of students?
Almost every age level is what we work with. I think our youngest class is kindergarten level, but more often than not, if we're sticking with the middle school to high school age groups, there's enough maturity within the student that they can have more in-depth conversations and being a little more self-aware of what their actions are doing or the impact others' actions have on them. But again, you can have restorative conversations with very young kids of being able to get them to start recognizing, you know, I might be mad because of this, but that might have happened because I did something to them, per se.
Something I struggle with during my tenure as a principal here in the district is getting staff to have restoratives with students. What recommendations would you guys have in terms of encouraging staff? Because some staff will feel like, well, I'm an adult, I'm not going to sit down with the student and try to work through the process. What would you guys recommend in terms of how we can encourage staff to take part in the process and recognize that it's not belittling to them?
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that, Lisa?
Yeah.
Okay, so from my experience as a restorative practitioner, what I find is most impactful is when you emphasize that this is a long-term process that actually includes transformative change, right? So instead of having to have a conversation every single day with the same student, right, we're changing our metric of success. We're giving them the opportunity to, you know, make positive changes and develop themselves in a more effective and productive way. With staff specifically, what I would encourage individuals to say is just emphasize that, you know, although this might not specifically be a position where you would have control over behaviors or conduct or misbehaviors, things like that, the goal of schools is to teach and to create a learning environment, right? And when we're in conflict with one another, there isn't a safe and supportive learning environment. So we need to address it. We need to figure it out. And as people in education and as educators and people who work with children, our job is student success. So that's not just being successful in math, science, language arts, it's being successful in all aspects of life. So I really emphasize the transformative aspect of it, and that it actually builds those traits so that, you know, they can build those skills into emerging adulthood.
Makes sense. Are there certain discipline infractions where this process will work better than others? For example, if two students were engaged in a fight, restorative occur after they come back for suspension, or could restorative be utilized in suspension? What are you guys' thoughts about that?
So really that's a case-by-case basis, because a lot of times before you get into a restorative conversation, there's got to be some direct dialogue with the two parties. Both parties have to feel that they're going to be safe, and we're not setting anyone up for additional harm to be done. So if a physical fight happened, again, it's going to take some individual conversations with each student to basically, are they willing to accept accountability or responsibility for what they did? Are they able to understand that the other person might have some strong emotions and feelings like that? And can they talk that through to figure out what happened and how they can make it better? It's always safety first. We don't throw kids back together if we know that there's going to be additional harm. So restorative can be done preventatively before a conflict happens, just so there's constant dialogue and communication. It can be in reaction to a conflict that happened. If somebody got into a yelling contest or a pushing match or whatever, to bring the parties together to figure out how they can get along and not be in the same situation in the future. And then also too, it helps that if there has been a serious infraction that a student has been suspended and coming back, nothing has changed since that student's been gone. There still needs to be a conversation about whether it's a teacher saying, I need you to respect my boundaries in my classroom, or it's the student saying, I need to make sure that you aren't rolling your eyes at me when I come back in the door. Because just because, you know, 1 day or 10 days have gone by, nothing within the dynamics between those parties have changed. That's where the restorative conversation comes into play. So it's recognizing what happened. It's saying that this is how I was hurt. This is how I was impacted. But also, if we want to be successful in our education, this is what we need to do to get through the rest of the day or the school year. Sometimes it's as easy as we're just not going to talk to each other. We're not going to look at each other. And other times when students recognize that they inadvertently hurt someone, they just say, oh, sorry, didn't mean to. And then they can figure out a way to get past that.
Now, does restorative occur after multiple incidences between students, or could this potentially be a one-time thing where students' feelings were hurt? Like, what will be the flow chart in terms of discipline at school level for students to be sent for restorative?
As I said, restorative can be preventative, and it also can be reactionary. So a lot of times if a student is struggling and maybe they're falling asleep in class or they're just not participating, having a goal setting conversation, having something to say, the teacher says, it's important for me to stay awake while you're on your Zoom meeting today. It's important to me. I need to hear from you why you're not showing up, why I keep seeing that you're being distracted. And having that conversation, the student says, oh, I'm important. Somebody paid attention that I was sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing too is, like, the more we have those conversations, they recognize somebody out there cares about me, whether it's my parent, my teacher, or just, you know, a friend, and bringing those relationships together so they can work together positively.
I would mention as well, Kyron, that the process isn't as effective if you only use it once. It's not like a one and done type process. I know that Lisa had mentioned that. But it takes patience, consistency, and care and concern on our end as adults to maintain the process time and time again. And really what we're looking for, the metric of success is not overnight change, right? It's not that my student's going to be a completely different student tomorrow, and that's what success means in restorative practices, right? So we look at a different metric of success, right? So is today better than yesterday? Is tomorrow better than today? You know, is this week better than last week? Is this month better than last month? So that's what we look at, right? So it's not, if it doesn't work, quote unquote, right? If you don't think that you've had a successful outcome, it doesn't mean just give up on the process entirely. We have to keep at it as adults.
Sure. So when we are back face to face, which hopefully is soon, what would you guys recommend as a process for students to obtain restorative justice services? Should schools set up a process where students can seek it out themselves and say, I have like a form, I want to take part in RJ, or should it solely be teacher or administrator led? What are you guys' thoughts about that?
Most schools have a different process set up, and that is really just done on the agreement of the principal and the teachers, because sometimes students can self-refer themselves. They can say, oh, you know, so-and-so is going to have a fight. I need to go down and do an RJ circle. Teachers can refer, administrators, social workers, support people can happen. I like to tell a story, and this happened for real, is a group of girls had went down to, I think, their middle school principal and said, principal, we need to have an RJ circle because the 5 of us are, you know, fighting it out over a boy or something or other. And they said, we need RJ. The principal said, well, hold on a minute, sit in the office. I need to go take care of the rest of my business. And when I come back, you know, we'll talk this through so you don't get into an altercation. By the time the principal came back, the students had picked up what we call a talking piece. And basically that says if you hold the pencil, you get a talk, everybody else has to listen. He saw these girls go ahead and start the process themselves, walk through the whole process of how they were hurt, how they think the other person was hurt. And the principal said he just sat back against the wall and watched it go on.
Wow.
And when he talked to our staff, he said, okay, I'm a believer. I see this. Because kids, once they do it a few times and they realize that there's going to be a change, then they take it on themselves as a new approach to conflict. And that's ultimately the goal, that they learn how to do that without getting themselves into harm or wrongdoing.
Mm-hmm.
That's powerful. Wow. Last question. At what point do parents come into the process? I've seen restorative circles where parents are involved as well. What would be a situation, example, where parents need to get on board in order to ensure that we're all on the same page?
Typically in our situation, it's a school-based conflict. There are times if it's a serious altercation that there are parents involved. They will be invited to the restorative conversation to be able to talk about, again, just because your one child might be having a physical altercation with another child, you've still got caring parents behind them who basically say, well, I need my needs met also. Because not only did my child get into a fight and how were they impacted, but also now I'm being impacted. And whether a suspension has happened and there's got to be more parenting time, or that some injury happened and that needs to be talked through. Again, we deal with the students, and if there are invested parties, we can also pull them together, again, after extensive as we do some intake to make sure there's going to be no additional harm and that we can work towards a solution or a resolution.
Perfect. Thank you very much, guys. We really appreciate this presentation tonight. Thank you, Ms. Bonnie and Mrs. Sinclair, for this phenomenal presentation on resolution services. Thank you, parents, community stakeholders, for joining us for this session of Parent University. The website is www.rsccm.org.
Nope, it's restorativejusticemi.org.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, I was looking at the top.
And you can use that one as well.
Oh, okay, great. And what's the phone number in case parents want to call, or schools? The phone number is
517-485-2274.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you to everyone for attending Parent University. My name is Kyron Harvell. Ladies, any final words regarding restorative services that you'd like to share with participants before we log off?
Just thank you so much. And we are here for your questions at any time. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us.
Sydney said it all.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, parents. Please join me this Friday for our K-8 principals, who will talk about our A-Day, which is our Seniors Learners Day, which actually took place today. It will take place at 5 o'clock through Parent University. Thank you for your support, and everyone have a good evening.